Would you say that, in fact, it's somewhat could have been predicted in that the model, the Latin America third way, if you will, that Lou was trying to promote, didn't have capital controls, and it was based on sort of a temporary financialization boom, as opposed to sort of some type of real economic growth or some mix in between. And so, in hindsight, were the policies of the Lula government over the last 5, 6, 7 years, in fact, the right ones, given that some of these things were foreseeable? And for Martin, on the recommendations, I of course wholeheartedly agree with everything that you proposed. My question is what's been discussed in terms of regional alternative sources of finance, which have long been proposed in sort of a new international economic order, which was the dream of 35 years ago. What's the real key? You mentioned several things: will, cross-national solidarity in the South, long-term interests as opposed to short-term interests, certain countries not being bought off by the North, so the G20 countries not being bought off, and then the other one leaving the North behind. If you could maybe, there's not one answer, but present what you think would be the most realistic path in which these, sort of organizations that are now, cutting their teeth and testing the international waters, how is this going to convert itself to real financial competition in the world economy in which the South can control its own destiny?
The central bank sets the short-term rate at 13.75%, which you can imagine what we have here if we had those kind of interest rates, and their inflation is about the same as here. So it's ridiculously high interest rates. They have also, recently we discovered that some of the biggest corporations were actually, these were industrial corporations supposedly, and they lost billions of dollars because they were speculating on the currency there. So not only they don't have capital controls, but they've also had this problem with their financial sector, their industrial sector being infected with the same kind of problems as the financial sector. The financial sector kind of rules the country, really, and that's why you've had overvalued currency as well until just now it's fallen some. So Brazil really, they did change some things. The minimum wage increased by about 100% in real terms, so there was some reduction in inequality, because that wage affects a lot more than like minimum wage does here, for example. But they definitely kept the neoliberal macroeconomic policy and development policies of the previous government, and as a result, they haven't had that much growth really, or the kind of redistribution that you could have if the economy was really growing.
I think there has been political will among some leaders. That's why these things got set up. The Bank of the South, South America, and I know that they're trying to set up a facility also for financing, for stabilization. So in other words, a kind of World Bank and IMF for Latin America. And maybe some leaders like Chavez and so on, they originated this idea, they had the political will. But now we are facing the technical expertise issue, as well as some political issues like whether you set up a bank, it should be $1, one vote, or it should be one country, one vote. It's very easy for us to say one country, one vote when we are putting in very little money. But if you're the one putting in $20 billion and you say that fellow is putting in $1 and I'm putting in $20 billion and I'm lending him the money, but he has equal say with me and then I might not get the money back. So all these issues I think have to be settled, and including the technical one of how the whole thing operates. It's very easy to criticize, it's very hard to create. And it's the same in Asia. Asia, this idea came out of a political will that we will never again be, held hostage by speculators or by the IMF. So they created a small Chiang Mai initiative, and now, because of this crisis we are having, they are upgrading it to an $18 billion stabilization fund, and they said, can China, Japan, and Korea put in 20 billion each, and the rest of us will put in 20 billion. So that was adopted in May and reaffirmed last month, but I don't know whether it's operationalized. And I put myself in China's shoes or Korea's shoes. If I'm putting 20 billion into this fund, is it a donation? I may not want to make super profits from it, but will I at least get my capital back with maybe 1 or 2% interest? Because that's what the US Treasury gives me. And if not, then how do I make sure that that money still comes back to me? Because my own constituency at home and my own conscience tells me that I must get my money back. So I think they have to solve all these really practical problems. If the technical issues are faced head on and there are technical solutions through expert groups, then the political will may become stronger. But of course that's not enough. You still need political will. But the political will, however strong it is, without the technical backup, you'll find the political will weakening. So I think the money is there, but we haven't quite organized ourselves because of all these issues. And if they ask us, I suppose we can form a civil society expert group to input into that. If they don't ask us, maybe we should still knock on the door. Because politically, I think these are very good moves that they are making.
Questions?
Hi, Rick Rowden with Action 8. Martin, just to have you elaborate on that a little bit further, what's going on with the Chiang Mai initiative. A lot of us who watch the IMF, of course, we are extraordinarily disappointed to see that there's some type of clause that says if you're going to borrow, you have to be in good standing with the IMF. Could you elaborate a little bit on what is that requirement? How did it get in there? And what do you think the prospects are for getting that out? And then also just getting back to your other reform proposal, you were talking about some type of mechanisms to stabilize commodity prices. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you envision there? Thanks.
The Chiang Mai initiative was actually initiated by a country like Malaysia, who really didn't like the IMF. At first, we wanted to have an Asian monetary fund. Then David Summers, or was it someone else? Stanley Fischer. They came to Asia and campaigned, physically came. Went to Korea, went to Japan, told these two countries, US is shedding blood for you because our soldiers are fighting, we fought against the Vietnam War for you, the Korean War for you. And Japan looked, then we provided a nuclear umbrella. Have you forgotten all these things? And they went to Philippines and India, and poof, that's the end of the Asian Monetary Fund. And then, okay, a small thing like the Shanghai Initiative, currency swaps, a few million and so on. But the ones who contributed to the swaps, including China, but of course Japan too, they said, we don't know whether we'll get our money back. So the only guarantee is that whoever wants to borrow money, the plan has to be approved by the IMF because somehow the IMF is smart in getting the money back. So that's how the thing went in. But now there is somehow an upgrading of the whole Chiang Mai initiative in an $80 billion fund. And the countries involved actually had a one-day meeting in China just the day before the summit of Asia and Europe that took place last month, or earlier last month, or was it earlier this month? And again, they reaffirmed what they had concluded in May, that they would do this and so on, but I don't know to what extent the feasibility plans and the details and so on have been worked out, because if you don't work this out, then you will have it as a political statement, but you won't operationalize it, like the Bank of the South and so on. Commodities, this is an age-old problem. The number one problem for the poorer countries like Africa and some Latin American countries and so on. It was never resolved. And here, I think the IMF and World Bank played a very bad role, because when the commodities ball was kicked to them from UNCTAD, UNCTAD was the master of commodities, and then they lost that because EU, US under Thatcher and Reagan pulled out of the commodity agreements and tried to kill UNCTAD actually for being the center of commodity agreement negotiations. Then the World Bank took it up. But their solution was market-based solutions such as the farmers should hedge, take part in hedging activities to hedge the future of the commodity prices for the next 2 years, 3 years. Nobody knows what is hedge. because we don't have hedge funds and hedging activities in developing countries. Thank goodness, because of course it's a false route. But over the last 2-3 years, as commodity prices boom, then this problem faded away. Because when your prices are very high, you don't think of how to stabilize commodity prices and so on. And now the commodity problem is back, so the issue is back again. They thought that it was a structural rise in commodity prices and it would rise forever over the next 10 years. But, and you decouple. But nobody thought of this huge crash, and nobody really understood that the rise in commodity prices was also significantly due to speculation rather than the real economy. So we are back to how to stabilize. And I don't see any international initiative out there. So the suppliers themselves may have to get their act together. A few years ago, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand came together as rubber producers and said we are going to reduce our production by 10%. The price of rubber shot up by 100% immediately and remained there. I think similar initiatives are now underway for palm oil and so on. We may have to have South-South cooperation, producers-only agreements without the consumers. For example, coffee. If Brazil, Kenya, Vietnam could somehow have the political will to say, let's sit down and cut our production by how much, let's work it out. Just as OPEC has done for oil. I think that's the way forward. To hope for suppliers and consumers together to come into the big commodity agreements that we had in the past is too ambitious a dream, unless you can get the Obama people to pledge that they're going to undo what Reagan did, and Gordon Brown to pledge that they're going to undo what Thatcher did, because that paradigm belongs to the past and we are now looking to the future, that we can dream the big dream again. But in the meanwhile, the practical things are the suppliers have to get their act together and cut supply.
Hi, Bhumika Mutala. I have a two-part question, and I want to start with the discussion that both Martin and Mark were having regarding the IMF and the sort of root causes of why it comes back into power. And I want to touch upon the monopoly it has on its signaling power. It's true, it does have a monopoly, and in the sort of, if we want to say, the market for macroeconomic assessment, there is a visible lack of players in this market. And to touch upon the root issue of why is it that countries feel that the IMF is best placed to make this macroeconomic assessment, to provide the signaling, to assure that a country has macroeconomic stability. And again, touching upon what Martin very clearly laid out in terms of the policy paradigm on which this macroeconomic stability is based. Obviously, the set of ideology that it's based is, anti-reflation, anti-expansionary policies that would aid a sort of natural stimulus process of virtuous growth coming back into a healthy economic state, such as Malaysia did after the Asian financial crisis. So my question is, why do countries not try to create or engender alternative sources of this assessment, of this signaling power? Where are national academic experts or regional experts, regional bodies? Why hasn't there been a larger movement to create alternative signaling sources? And why does the IMF have retained such a monopoly despite its explicit failure in the Asian financial crisis? You would think countries would stand up and say enough is enough. It obviously was part of the causes and exacerbated the economic crisis 10 years ago. Why is it allowed to play such a prominent role in the economic crisis 10 years later? And then related to this is the explicit inequity of fiscal stimulus. We're seeing China with a $500 billion plus fiscal stimulus in place, the US, Germany, Japan. But what about the low-income countries, which, as Martin also pointed out, are facing collapsing currencies, capital outflows, soaring debt levels, and with the debt levels being in foreign exchange and foreign exchange reserves being depleted? What now in terms of where is that injection of capital going to come from for developing countries? Where are the sources for this injection of capital liquidity. And on that note, the alternatives, such as the $80 billion fund, would that be a light of hope? Would that be a ray of silver for this sort of fiscal stimulus and capital injection that's so sorely needed for the developing countries? I'd like to ask both Mark and Martin to provide ideas on this, and also have people from the audience join in about ideas on the sort of geopolitics of the fiscal stimulus occurring right now globally.
Well, the IMF has been playing a very dirty role, and I think maybe we haven't exposed it enough. I've come to the conclusion that the IMF's role, and explicitly understood it, because it's a creature of the creditors, foreign creditors. And they want to get, you see, the IMF lends money. They want to get it back with the interest, so that it can retain its AAA status, and it can return the money to its own shareholders, which are mainly from the North, and of course is controlled by Treasury. But as you said, most of IMF organized funds do not even come from the IMF. It's a signal. And you have other creditors then who, if the IMF says yes, then they will also come along for the IMF package. And then it's also a signal for the by the private sector and the bilateral debts and so on. So the priority of the IMF actually is that when they give a loan to a developing country, they want to get it back, plus they want the foreign creditors to get it back. So they have become actually the guarantors in terms of debt collecting for foreign creditors, including themselves. So how do they do it? So if that is understood as their main priority, then the rest makes sense. That macroeconomic, monetary policies and so on makes sense in a narrow, short-term view of themselves. That is, they tell the governments, I'm lending you this 4 billion or 5 billion to Indonesia or 12 billion, but you can't use this money that I'm lending you to save your local banks and companies. Because I'm lending you this money so that you can repay the loans that you took in foreign exchange. So here is one set of money coming in so that you can use that money to repay. And then whether you can repay the new set of money that was lent you is an issue we'll settle later. Now, we don't want you to divert this money that we are actually giving to you so that you can go back to the foreign creditors and you service your debt by leakage to the local economy, by lending to local companies and saving the local banks, and education and health. You know, your own budget to boost education and health and reflate your economy. Because then you are taking away the money that we are lending you to do your local thing. When what we want is to give you the money so that you can rechannel back Washington, IMF, to you give back to New York, Wall Street, and then to you. I think that was what that whole model was about. But then, as I said, it's a short-term thing. I lend you money, you repay these people. But how are you going to repay the money that I lent you if your whole economy is collapsing? So the second generation problem of how you repay this thing was never solved, so the debt continued. Okay. Now, the mechanism by which this money that I give to the government is then repaid has a problem, because much of this loans that you have to repay are in the private sector. So what they did was, as a conditionality, the government has to guarantee the repayment of private sector debt. That's what they did to Korea, that's what they did to Africa. Government has to guarantee debts that were contracted between private sector and private bank. So all this now becomes government debt. So that was a mechanism. So IMF lends money to government. Government pays private loans and debts. So the wonderful debate you had in Congress and so on in this very town itself. Why should we bail out if it's a private investor, private shareholders and so on? And then you begin to withdraw that power from Paulson. Never takes place in the IMF. It's just taken for granted that that's what the IMF's role is a private debt collector as well as a public debt collector. So understanding this, and if that model is going to continue, then why should we use the IMF? It's totally ridiculous, because it doesn't solve, it may solve that first generation debt problem, but not the second generation anyway, and the country continues in debt. I think the second point you brought up is absolutely important as well. I think Dean Baker, your colleague, wrote this thing about, was it U.S. gives smallpox, or was it biological weapon? Okay. So the problem is created here. It has spread. And you don't solve these people's problem, you solve your own. And that's what should be done. And to some extent, I think there's been some innovation. The Treasury has also given 30 billion per country of liquidity of US dollars to Korea, Singapore, and so on. Countries they trust and it's in their model and they think can pay back. So that's the beginning. Maybe Treasury should do that for the whole world. Since they cause the problem, they should be giving liquidity money to developing countries and not just Europe, and they begun to do it. Same with the IMF. IMF has started a facility of lending without conditionality to countries that they think are really solvent and are doing very well but have temporary problems like South Korea, I think Brazil, and a few other countries. So that's something new. It's like no condition because I know you won't borrow with stupid conditions. I know I'll get the money back because you are really viable economies. You have a liquidity problem, so I'm going to lend to you just as the Treasury has been doing so and so. So you have little shoots here and there that are coming out. Maybe we should demand that these kinds of loans, I don't know, Mark, what do you think, that these kinds of loans should be expanded, manifold, extended, or whether there's a catch in it as well.
Yeah, that's one thing I didn't really explain, but I wanted to actually, was that, you know, the whole purpose of balance of payments lending in these situations, especially where there's liquidity problems, but even when there are more serious, you know, current account deficits, the whole purpose of it is to enable the country to undertake the adjustment without having to go through a terrible recession, right? Like the United States is adjusting its trade deficit right now with going through a very bad recession. Any country can do that, but the idea of having the external lending, hard currency lending, is so that the country can adjust gradually if it has a balance of payments problem, or if it doesn't, if it's just coming under speculative attack, then what that facility does is just prevent, it provides a guarantee, it provides insurance so that investors stop pulling their money out. And that's what most of these countries actually need. And that is the kind of thing that the IMF is saying, okay, we'll provide that in this facility that Mark just described, the new facility. But the problem is they are making political choices. Like, you don't see them loaning this money to countries that they don't like, even if those countries actually have a lot of reserves and are just coming under speculative attack. So the only thing I would add in terms of the question, two things. I mean, you know, Martin has very well described one aspect of the IMF, which is, I think, perhaps the most important, is a debt collector. You know, and that's what they did in Argentina, for example. They failed ultimately, but they were willing to squeeze the country and really deny the credit and everything just to try and get a better, more money for the defaulted creditors. That was a classic case where they were willing to destroy that place just to get a little more money from the defaulted creditors. And but I would say there's two other aspects of it. One is it is also an agent of the U.S. Government to a certain extent, and sometimes the European governments when they have their particular demands. And these can be just even corporate interests, you know, particular companies. And in the case of Europe, it's what it usually is because they don't have the big strategic control that the United States has. But sometimes they're just pursuing, like they did in the Asian crisis, you know, when they attached all those conditions about foreign ownership of banks and things like that. They use it to get it to break in there. And then I have to add one third thing, is I think is only comparable, say, to the medieval church. They have an ideological component that's not really rational. You know, Stiglitz used to joke that they made back in the 1950s when they designed their 5 or 6 accounting identities that make up their financial programming, that they got they made a sign error. Like when a professor makes a sign error on the blackboard, they put in a minus instead of a plus, and they've never really corrected it. They do have an ideological problem that makes them much worse than an actual an organization that was only concerned about getting their money back and getting money for the creditors. That's what makes them, I think, more damaging than, say, private banks. Now, the last thing, just very briefly, in terms of how can they do this or why do they enable things to come back, I think it is ultimately a question of politics and legitimacy. Look at Latin America, okay? No country has publicly, at least, announced that they want money from the IMF. And that's because the IMF has been thoroughly discredited. And their cartel broke down there in a certain way, too. Like, for instance, when Evo Morales took the presidency of Bolivia in 2006, they had been under IMF agreements for 20 years straight. And then they just said, no, we don't want one. And not only that, they said, when they said that, they asked the IMF, well, what about all the other loans and grants we get from Europe and everyone else? Is that still going to be dependent on the IMF? And the IMF said no. Because the IMF knew they had no real power to do that. At that time especially, you had Chavez, Venezuela was loaning money to everyone. They loaned $6 billion. They ended up loaning $6 billion to Argentina, for example. So there was no point in the IMF trying to enforce their creditors' cartel, so it just collapsed. And so it really depends on the political situation in the region. And that's why I think these regional solutions are going to be extremely important. And it's important for us, and especially since we have a new president, we're going to have a new executive director, to say, here in the United States, we want our government to support the regional solutions rather than the monopoly and the cartel.
Actually, I just have a quick follow-up to the last answer and to the first question. I think that we can understand why, and it's more of a question about the politics or the obstacles it has to be politics. I think we can understand why Brazil, with the model it has been following, hasn't been able to impose or has imposed capital controls. But what in your mind, Mark, is the reason that countries like Argentina or Bolivia or Ecuador or Venezuela in the last few years haven't moved more in that, given that they have managed to reject the IMF, and given that the changing international financial architecture is more difficult, the individual countries can carry out policies like imposing strict capital controls and so on, but there hasn't been a lot of movement in that direction. So I was wondering what you thought the reasons, what the obstacles are for that kind of. And Argentina, the last few weeks, has been spending reserves, defending the peso, and so on. So just that quick question.
Well, it's one of those cases where you do have to fix the roof while the sun is shining, and the capital is coming in. That's when you have to have the controls. It is harder to do it on the way out. Venezuela did, in fact, they have capital controls, and that is one reason why, right now, their balance of payments is still improving, while others are worsening. But the other countries didn't do it, I think, because they saw, they didn't see the necessity during the time when, the last few years has been the best growth you've had for quite a while.
But in the sense that Malaysia did right after the start of the East Asian crisis. In other words, that Malaysia also didn't do it when the sun was shining, but they managed to impose a different model, or at least for a period.
I think the reason why countries are very reluctant to do it is their own ideology. They have imbibed that ideology because our finance ministers, their officials, the central bankers are all trained by the IMF. The IMF Institute, for example, they have a big institute here. They have an institute in Singapore for Asia, and I went to one of their courses. They have like 40 courses a year. Each course training 30, 40 central bank and finance officials. Then they belong to the church. They believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and if you don't go to Mass every Sunday, and if you don't obey what your parents tell you, then you will go to hell. So nobody likes to go to hell. So one is the ideology. Two is, even if the conditions change so drastically, just as in the US, conditions change so drastically that Mr. Paulson said, I just cannot do this payoff thing. I just cannot. But then if I don't do it, it's even worse. So please all forgive me, we just have to do it. Excommunicate me if you want, but I just have to do it. I have to say Goldman sucks. I think the moment of truth is if I don't do it, Goldman Sachs will collapse. And my $900 million of Goldman Sachs stocks will be worth nothing. So that's the moment of truth. And so when the moment of truth comes, for Malaysia is a firm believer of the free trade system, the free capital system. It followed the IMF for 1 year, although it did not take an IMF loan, but it invited the IMF to come. And Malaysia did even more, it was more IMF than the IMF. It cut expenditure by 20%, it raised the interest rates by 10 percentage points, more than Thailand or Indonesia and so on. And the economy collapsed from plus 8% to minus 8%. That's the moment of truth when the politician faces that he's going to lose office, there's riots on the streets. And in the case of Malaysia, the Prime Minister was not an economist. That's what saved Malaysia. So he did not go through this chattel, he did not go through this program. So he said, this is ridiculous. This is what the IMF is telling us to do. It's totally ridiculous from a common sense point of view. If you raise the interest rates, then the companies cannot pay back the banks, even if it's not in foreign exchange, and then the banks will have non-performing loans and the banks collapse. And the companies collapse, and the economies collapse, and my government collapse. So it's just common sense. So what the IMF is trying to tell us to do, actually he said, why are 28-year-old MBAs from the United States coming to tell me how to run my economy when I've been having 10% growth for the last 20 years, I'm the Prime Minister, I'm elected. Who is this guy? Who is this joker? I'm the Prime Minister, tell him to go to hell. So after 1 year, that's what he did. Then they instituted common sense policies, which is the policies that the United States does when the United States is in crisis. Reduce the interest rate, boost the government expenditure. Then they said, yeah, sir, if you do this, the currency will collapse. Okay, fix the exchange rate. How do you fix the exchange rate? Actually, you know what he did? Because the central bank did not cooperate with him. The central bank is a believer. They said, we refuse to give you any answers. This is beyond, we'll go to hell. So the Prime Minister is an IT maniac. So at night he went to do a Google search, put in currency control, currency stabilization. Then you find that Argentina and Hong Kong had this currency board system, but there's no solution. See, Suharto was trying to find that solution, and American economists went to give that advice to Suharto. It was the wrong advice. You can fix your currency through the currency board system, in which the money supply in your country depends on the foreign reserves you have. So your monetary, the supply of money, you don't have control anymore. It depends on your foreign reserves. If your foreign reserves is dropping, then your monetary supply is dropping, and then you have a recession. So he discovered the Chinese system, which is just an administrative fixing of the rate. That is, the central bank will exchange US dollar with the commercial banks at this rate. And all commercial banks with your normal commission and so on will exchange at that rate. Full stop. We don't link it to any foreign reserves or anything. So we actually borrowed the Chinese system through a Google search of the Prime Minister at midnight. So he's not an economist. If he was, and all the local economists said, there's no solution, sir, there's no system, sir, you cannot do it, sir. Okay, I'll do a Google search. So we fixed so that when we lower the interest rates, the currency would not collapse. Then they said, yes, sir, but you see, if you lower the interest rate and you boost the finance, which is the correct macroeconomic policy, and your currency won't collapse. Because your currency collapses, you can't repay your foreign debt. Then you have to go to the IMF, and the game is over. But sir, you do these three things, the capital will flow out. Yes, that stops the capital from flowing out. Another instrument, capital controls. That's how capital controls came in. And the capital controls was very clever. It said, if funds are coming in and out due to trade, allow it. If it's foreign direct investment, allow it. If it's profits from foreign investment, allow it. No capital controls on that. In other words, the IMF policy of 1945 to 1973, we rediscovered that. In other words, for the current account, no capital controls. For the capital account, if foreigners have brought their money in and put it in the stock market, we tell them, for the next 12 months, you can't take your money out. The short-term capital flow. And for local people, and local companies, you can't take your money out as well. Local people you can control. There won't be so much of an international outreach. So this was put in place. It was a very clever selection of what controls to put and what controls not to put. And that was part of an entire package of monetary and economic policies. Then the government regained monetary independence, and you know what it did? They did what the US is now trying to do, but at that time condemn us. That is, then they set up two other vehicles that will be very interesting to you. One vehicle is called a vehicle of the government to inject capital into failed banks. Sounds familiar? The second vehicle was purchase of non-performing loans. We didn't call it toxic assets, we call it non-performing loans from the banks into this vehicle, which later would be sold. And actually, the government didn't spend much money in the end. They spent money, but then they recovered the money. So in the end, we got away almost for free. And this whole thing was done in a big package in a matter of months, just as you did. Very familiar sounding, because this package of capital injection and purchase of toxic waste was borrowed from Sweden when they had a financial crisis. Through another Google search. Now, when Malaysia did this, it was condemned. Universally condemned by everybody from Soros, Larry Summers, Fischer, IMF, World Bank. They said, you're going to collapse. They said, this Prime Minister is mad because he does not understand the world of modern international finance. Those were the words. You see? And he said, no, I understand. This world is built on leverage. This world is built on Chevy. This world is built on hedge fund borrowing a leverage of 30:1. And then I started asking the bankers, they said, yeah, Prime Minister had 30:1. Actually, the Prime Minister was wrong. Because the LTCM scandal finally revealed that the leverage was 50:1. You have $1 of capital, $1 billion of capital, you borrow 50 billion from the banks. You take the 50 billion and you spin derivatives until you have a position of $1 trillion of positions in the stock market, currency, and so on. So the ultimate leverage is 1,000:1. That's a hedge fund. LTCM revealed that. So the Prime Minister was more clever, and of course Soros knew, because he's a master of that. So they had a big slanging match. Prime Minister said Soros is a moron because he's destroying value and capital. Soros said this man is a menace to his own country, he doesn't understand the world of modern finance. The US condemned him, everybody condemned him, the IMF sent a team to Asia to, he had brilliant idea to set up an Asian monetary fund and do this swaps. You know why? We are not children, because the Malaysian Central Bank a few years earlier had also become a hedge fund and was speculating the currency market and lost $2 billion to Soros. So we were players, we got burned, but we understood the world of international finance, and we were the losers, but we understood when the other side came, we knew what it was. So you have to withstand the international condemnation that comes from breaking the ideology, and it's very frightening. It means private capital will not flow in for some time, and in fact they did, they boycotted Malaysia. But the government calculated, if we do this, foreign capital will not go up because we have blocked it. New foreign capital will not come in. And I think they were very smart. They said, new foreign capital will not come in anyway in a country that is having -8% growth. So what we lose is nothing. What we gain is 1 year of freedom to institute our macroeconomic policies. At the end of the day, it wasn't a financial ideological thing, it was that we have to drive interest rates down to 3% or 2%. And then we have to force the banks to lend. Okay, against all orthodox, that the IMF came and said, Basel II, Basel I, capital ratio, and you have to become more disciplined because the banks were not disciplined, that's why you're in trouble. And we said, no. The patient, unfortunately, ate a lot of fat. He had high cholesterol and he's got a heart attack. Okay? So he's lying on bed, he's got a heart attack, he's almost dead. Now, this is not the moment to lecture the patient that you should not have eaten all this beef, you should not have got all this fat. You should have a lifestyle change, and what you should do, you should stop eating, and you should take exercise. But that's what the World Bank, the IMF did. The IMF went to the patient and correctly diagnosed, you're having a heart attack. Because of your bad lifestyle. Now get out from your bed and run around the field 6,000 times at the fastest possible rate. That's what the patient did, and the patient collapsed and died. You see, it's a sequencing problem, but it's a very big sequencing problem. You don't tell the patient that when he's half dead, you bring him back to life by some kind of injection, statins and so on, and then when the patient finally is better, you say, you please take a little walk with a walking stick. And then when you're better, you stop eating all this food. And one fine day, maybe he can take a little jog again. But if you get your sequencing wrong, the patient is dead. And tomorrow you say, well, anyway, he's dead, let's go to another patient. That's what they have to you. So Malaysia understood that. They said, forget about this capital ratio, 8% improving. We're going to break all rules, which is what Paulson is now doing. No more reserve requirements for the banks. The ratio can go to hell. The Prime Minister sat down every morning with a team. He's a very practical man. Okay, all these banks will remove their non-performing loans. This is what Paulson should have actually hired him. So all the banks will remove their non-performing loans. We have had capital liquidity injection into that. What are they doing? So each bank, how many loans have they given for new houses? How many loans have they given for motor cars? Then he contacts the housing developers. You start giving discounts on your housing prices, and you give furniture free of charge. Okay? Then the banks will lend the consumer money. You give a good price for the house. The banks are going to be forced to lend. And they set a target for the bank. Increase your loans by 15% per month. Okay? Which is totally unorthodox. And then they will ring every bank. You only 10%. Where's your other 5%? And then they ring the consumers. Why are you not buying houses? Buy the houses. The best buy in the world today. Wow. So the economy expanded. But in the meanwhile, the Prime Minister had to shut his ear and eyes and not listen to CNN. And everybody was condemning him, private investors. So you need to have a clear plan. You need not to know economics. You need to have a Prime Minister who's in charge of the country and jails all his opponents while he's doing this great experiment. You need to absorb the resignation of the central bank governor. Deputy resigned and said, we can't do this thing. It's beyond our conscience. It's against my religion. He resigned. So, and then pull the whole thing through. So that's why the developing countries don't do it. The confluence of coincidences to allow this kind of thing to happen is very bad. Now, in the case of Argentina, they didn't do it. Capital flew, government collapsed, tried something, collapsed again, tried something, collapsed again, and finally somebody in the government said, I want to abide by market rules, and that is, we will repay the debt according to the market price. Okay? Which is a big debate in your conference here. When you buy the toxic waste, at what price? Mark to market, or the book value price of the past, or the value price of 3 years from now, which nobody knows what it is. They can't solve that debate, and therefore he's given up the plan, isn't it? I don't know why he's given up the plan. But if Argentina says, well, the market says the loan is only 10 cents, I'm going to pay you the full market rate. And they say, no, the full market rate is a mortal sin, because the foreign creditors 100% must come in. So there was a big fight, and I think this was the great achievement of Argentina. Malaysia's great achievement was prevent the thing from going out and institute all the macroeconomic policies to save the country. Argentina was too late to save the country, we are dead. But even the dead man can say, I'll pay you 10 cents from my estate and not 100 cents per dollar so that my children can survive. So these two policies, I think, are great examples. But most developing country governments, either like a Lula who wants to prove to the world that the trade union leader will abide by market rules, or they are too frightened to do it because they don't have this clear vision in mind. They don't have a clear vision of what is a reflationary set of macroeconomic policies. I think that's what Malaysia did. I want to reclaim my economy. The real economy is the important thing. Everything else you tell me is a barrier, I will get rid of these barriers. You tell me this instrument doesn't, okay, I find a new instrument for a new problem. And then let's get on with it and just do it, you know. But that macroeconomic core is what is the most important, which is what the US is trying to do. Reduce the interest rates to almost zero, pump the government expenditure up, have very easy monetary policy. Now the consumer is a problem. Now we're going to boost the consumer. Whether this is right or wrong, I don't know, but this is the normal Keynesian policy. And Malaysia was just a very good student of the United States, but the US condemned Malaysia for being a good student.
Well, I think we've heard today, this has been amazing, a lot of the messages and policies that we need to be pushing for in our media and advocacy work. I especially want to thank Martin Khor for coming and spending such a wonderfully long time with all of us and educating us not only about things to look for from the past that can serve as examples, but actually the kind of concrete policies that we all need to be pushing for the future. So I thank you, Martin and Mark, for your excellent presentations and for your audience for your engaged questions. Thank you so much.